The Catacomb Club stood on the corner of Temple Street and Bond Street, Wolverhampton, from 1967 to 1974. It was a well-known venue for the Northern Soul scene. Indeed, it started before the use of the word Northern Soul and was originally seen as an R&B club. This is probably what makes the Cats so important in the history of Northern Soul. Its longevity almost tracing the history of Northern Soul. Although it was also a concert venue with artists including Brinsley Schwartz, Uriah Heep, Judas Priest, and yes, Steve Dobson owned the Catacombs and also Eve's Boutique, although he sold it to Astor Entertainment in 1973, who were owned by the music promoter Tony Perry, along with Stan and Peter Fielding, Len Rowe and George Maddox. Housed in a former lead smelting works, it's close to where the job centre is now, and is marked by a blue plaque on the original site at what is now Molineux House. The windowless second-storey room was closer to a cellar in the sky than a typical nightclub. Nicotine-stained condensation would drip from the walls, generated by the heat of the pill-filled dancers. I say without a drinks licence. I don't think it had a drinks licence. Certainly for the soul dues, it didn't, and it served orange squash by the pint. It was noted for its many corridors and a fire escape made of wood where people would congregate to escape the heat. Nor could it obtain a regular all-night licence, and so suffered in comparison to larger venues in the north. Fans would attend the Catacombs until 2 o'clock closing time, though originally it was midnight, then drive to other venues for an all-nighter. In many respects, the Cats were something of a youth club for Black Country youth, with an interest in Northern Soul and pills. Although it was very much as part of the Northern scene, unlike Dudley Youth Services all-nighters, which were, I think, in Brierley Hill. In fact, they were organised by my friend Gells, whom I met many years later through work. He had been a recently qualified youth worker at the time, with no knowledge of Northern Soul. And many of the Cats regulars were my age, but alas, I never visited. The main reason being Westmid's buses did not reach Shrewsbury, and Midland Red and British Rail were not so compassionate towards Shropshire's youth. Nevertheless, I became very close to the Wolverhampton crowd, most of whom had been regulars, not least thanks to Dot, an ex-girlfriend. Also, as I listen to ex-Cat sounds, I realise how formative they have been on my preferences, despite believing that the Wheel and Mecca have been more important to me. In 1972, the Cats closed briefly for refurbishment when Astor Entertainment took over. Not that anyone seemed to notice when it reopened. Certainly by 1974, there was also a Friday and popular Wednesday night, as a result of it being free to members. Although was there also a Thursday night, as well as the regular Saturday. The Cats' heyday was in 1973, when it competed with Blackpool Mecca for the latest sounds. This coincided with the closure of the Golden Torch in Tunstall, Stoke-on-Trent, and prior to the opening of Wigan Casino, which ultimately killed off the Cats. On the 13th of July 1974, the Catacombs held a rare all-nighter to send the club off in style. It also held a nighter on the March 23rd in 1974, at which Blue Max Millwood, Pep Ian Papira from Stourbridge, and Basil DJ'd. Unfortunately, this was after the casino had opened, and many left early for Wigan. Pep was a regular attendee at the Cats since the age of 15, and was a local record dealer, as had many of the latter DJs. I understand there was also an all-nighter planned for February or March 1972, but I understand it never happened. There were about 1,000 people from all over the country in the venue for the last night, with a capacity of half of that. The heat was so intense that the building's red paint melted off the walls, as though the club itself was bleeding. Grieving fans made cassette recordings of the final playlists and carved their names into the brickwork. As the morning drew closer, pink membership cards littered the floor, discarded tributes to the club that had become so beloved. When finally they left the catacombs, they were haunted by the words of "Where Have All the Flowers Gone" by Walter Jackson. Carl Farmerdine, real name Carl Woodruff, from Birmingham, but who later moved to Aldridge, introduced to the Catacombs by recommendation of local soul aficionados Ricky Tomaskiak and Alan Price in 1968. Carl and the Cats' signature tune, Leon Hayward's Baby Reconsider, which he found at F.L. Moore's in Leighton Buzzard. In the early days, F.L. Moore's shops in the home counties were major importers, especially of the Rictic label, although many of Carl's sounds were found at the Diskery in Birmingham. Carl also found Tammy Lynn's I'm Gonna Ray From You and the Tams' Hey Girl Don't Bother Me, which were hits on their re-release in the UK. Also in 1968 there was a DJ named Gobbo, of whom I know very little. Alan S. Smith and Bob Crocker were the main DJs, 1969 to 71, until Bob died and Froggy joined the lineup, followed by Blue Max and Graham Waugh. Alan S. and Bob Crocker opened a record shop on Stafford Street. On the way to Leicester to purchase new stock, the pair were involved in a car accident. Bob was sadly killed. Alan S. was confined to hospital for 3 months. Pep replaced Alan S. in 1973 and was joined by Torch DJ Alan Day from Horsley Woodhouse, Derbyshire. Neil Rushton from Aldridge, but originally Birmingham, also DJ'd on Saturday nights in the last year, as did Bill Baker. At some point there was also a DJ from Gloucester. I suspect Steve Smith, who went on to be a mainstay at the 8, reflecting the large number of people who travelled up from Gloucester. I don't think Barmy Barry ever DJ'd at the Cats, but he was certainly a regular at the Golden Torch and the Lafayette, as more of a mainstream DJ. Following the closure of the Cats, certainly the manager moved to the Lafayette on Thornley Street. This was also owned by Astra Entertainment and had been built, or at least converted, by them, the building which included their offices. Pep ran a regular Monday night at the Lafayette, and the odd all day. Odd indeed, as I recall it being on an Easter Tuesday, then a public holiday in the West Midlands, both of which I attended. I also recall seeing Pep putting on Dex's Midnight Runners at Lafayette, and standing next to Robert Plant, facing a glitter painting on the wall of him. I also saw the Angelic Upstarts there, but don't think Pep had a hand in this. Pep emerged as something of a focal point for Northern Soul in Wolverhampton, maybe thanks to his nights at the Lafayette or possibly his record shop on Queen Street. It was from Pep's shop that I bought the latest releases from the US, including Charles Johnson, Prince Philip Mitchell and Alfie Davidson, which ultimately led to me coining the term modern soul. Although I should also mention his sadly missed wife, Helen from Dudley, a Cats dancer and robust organiser of the unruly Wolverhampton crowd. Graham Waugh owned a record store at the Oasis in Birmingham, although I'm sure he was from Walsall, maybe even Aldridge. As a result, he would go on regular buying trips to the US, and hence often had the very latest tunes. He later owned a clothing store, in Hereford I think, but he's now back on the scene. Whilst Neil Rushton ran some of the best old dayers at the time, at the Ritz in Manchester, Blackpool Mecca, and I believe involved in a Locarno in Birmingham. He also had a record store in Lichfield Street, Walsall, although I recall visiting a store elsewhere in Walsall, which largely sold his reissues of Catacombs classics. Despite having worked as a newspaper reporter, he became something of a music executive, including managing Inner City. Blue Max also owned a record shop in Wednesfield and was somewhat formative in John Kojak Harvey's Yate All-Nighters. Alan Day owned House of Sounds on New Street in Burton-on-Trent. Having accused the Cats of being more like a youth club, maybe I should revise that. Yes, many at the Cats were young, but mostly local from the Black Country, in particular the Western Black Country from Wolverhampton through Tipton to Dudley. It was from these local youths that a cadre of collectors and DJs emerged. In many respects, this reflects how the northern scene is today, with most towns having a local club rather than a nighter, with some notable collectors and DJs. Where I would highlight the difference is that the Cats, like the Wheel and the Mecca, was dedicated to playing new releases, especially during Graham Waugh's time.